Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child developmental psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in how we study development. That is, this is a research methods chapter. No prelude is necessary, so let's jump right into it. All right, let's begin by talking about the scientific method, the hashtag I fucking love science. We all love it, don't we, folks? All right, so it is an approach that organizes current information and generates new ideas that extend understanding. There are two types, broadly speaking: basic research and applied research. Basic research is defined as, or characterized as, the type of research where the primary goal is to add to our understanding of a phenomenon we are interested in and to help us refine our theories. Applied research: type of research where the goal is to solve immediate problems or improve the human condition. Parenting programs, classroom practices, and national policies. So kind of the big takeaways here for basic researchers, they're not exactly concerned about like what the real world implications are. They're kind of just in it to, well, learn things, discover new information, refine theories, maybe develop new theories. So they're kind of just the nut and bolts, whatever. I'll stare at a neuron or some system of, or a neurological system, a genetic system, some kind of gene, and I'll just investigate this for decades or years or whatever. So just very much focused on kind of just like an understanding of a construct, to, generally speaking, to add to some kind of theory. While applied research is kind of like you're doing research to kind of theoretically solve or contribute to the solution of a a social problem or just something that exists within the real world. And this is basically where I fall on this, in this dichotomy, which really isn't a dichotomy we'll get to momentarily, but, my research is kind of looking at the impact of war trauma, economic policy, kind of just trauma in general, kind of done so with the hope of kind of critiquing certain whatever policies or systems, or just, and maybe designing programs or something to kind of deal with those effects related to trauma. Now, in reality, this is presented as, or I should say, this is presented as a dichotomy, but in reality, these two types of research methods or approaches, I should say, really go hand in hand, wherein applied researchers use and read studies from basic researchers in order to kind of, again, understand kind of the nuts and bolts of like biology and kind of like the mechanism. So I'm interested again in kind of like these macro traumas. I still kind of have to understand like what is it that's like going on here on a biological and neurological and genetic level. And at the same time, basic researchers are still, in general, kind of like concerned about the application of their research. And thus, this is kind of like where ethics come in. So although this is presented as a dichotomy here, it's really kind of two sides of the same coin. Some people falling on one end of the spectrum more than another, and you can kind of bounce back and forth. Moving on to psychology specifically as a science, psychology is intimately familiar to all of us. Memory, learning, love, sleep, dreams, personality are all parts of our everyday lives. Because these psychological phenomena are so recognizable to us, we may assume that we understand them. Yet, we need a systematic approach to evidence. Science consists of a set of attitudes and skills designed to prevent us from fooling ourselves and fooling others. Science begins with empiricism, the premise that knowledge should initially be acquired through observation. Science refines our initial observations, subjecting them to stringent tests to determine whether they are accurate. Observations that stand up to rigorous scrutiny are retained, while those that don't are revised or discarded. So everybody interested, or who's a psychology major, or kind of just everybody in general, psychology is very like a field that a lay person can connect with, and we all kind of have personal connections to psychology because it literally exists everywhere around us. If you think about all those environmental factors, and really what we're studying is like the study of behavior, or study of biological processes, study of genetic processes, or in the case of development, the study of change. And these are huge things that are literally just like the study of like humanity in their everyday lives. So this, because of that, that appeal and how like real world applicable this is, people are interested in, and thus will kind of draw their own conclusions. We all kind of make conclusions about the world around us. We all kind of walk around the world and say, oh, okay, that person is doing this. action because of XYZ. So we all kind of draw conclusions about humanity in general, why people are doing certain behaviors, why certain institutions exist. Even within all institutions that exist, political, economic, there are assumptions about humanity built into them. So what is humanity? What are our goals of humanity? All these things are embedded in institutions. And again, so thus, based on our real world, the real world application of this field, and humanity's general need to make sense about the world around them, psychology can be prone to kind of like people making conclusions about, or grand conclusions about humanity based on their daily observations, which can be problematic because you only live your immediate world. You don't understand. It's basically very difficult to understand what all of humanity is doing and why they are doing it just based on your daily observation. This is not really a systematic way about understanding humanity, and this is kind of when science comes in or whatever. We need kind of stringent, systematic ways of understanding humanity and testing all those aspects of psychology, whatever, personalities, memory, learning, love, etc. We need to approach this in a systematic way so that we can come to firm conclusions and form hypotheses and test those hypotheses to hopefully come to some more valid, or at least the most valid conclusions we can come with at this historical moment of time as possible. And not only that, using kind of science allows us to kind of cycle out bad hypotheses, bad theories. So although like a lay person or anybody can just make up any theory about humanity or whatever, and then they'll just say, okay, well, that's just what it is. There's really no way to go about like formally testing this. Well, in science, kind of theoretically, this is not always the case. If there's kind of initial observation or some kind of study that finds a result, right? And it would say that result ends up being incorrect. But still, that result ended up creating all these new theories and all these new fields of research. Well, theoretically, through time, as researchers from around the world try and replicate those studies, try and conduct their own studies related to similar constructs, the idea here is that we find new evidence, and then we can scrutinize whether our current understanding of psychology is, valid or not. So kind of using this systematic approach allows us to have the firmest and the most valid understanding of psychology possible in a given moment of time. This doesn't always work out. This process can take a long time sometimes. There's a lot of theories that float around for decades that end up, we didn't really know that. Or that wasn't so accurate. That happens. It's not like this magical thing. The point is that theoretically, systematically, we can weed out things or conclusions and ideas that are inaccurate and then hopefully replace them with more accurate conclusions. Scientific theory is an explanation for a large number of findings in the natural world, including the psychological world. It ties multiple observations together into one pretty package/narrative. Good scientific theories should do more than account for existing data. They generate predictions regarding new data we haven't yet observed. For a theory to be scientific, it must lead to novel predictions that researchers can test, falsifiable. And I talk about this in later chapters, but kind of the idea, theory, people use this in kind of like normal day conversation as kind of just like an idea or hypothesis, which is fine. You don't have to be like annoying about it or whatever. But in science, theory means a specific thing. And kind of our idea of theory is that it explains a good theory explains previous research findings. So we have all these thousands and thousands of research findings, correct? Well, a theory, theoretically, is going to explain those research findings. And not only that, those previous research findings, but also make new predictions that for research that hasn't been conducted yet. And the good thing about a theory and using the scientific method is that you can test those predictions and say you do a research project about how left-handed peoples are inherently criminals, and say my theory about the world is that all the differences, all the ills of the world, everything that exists is because left-handed people, there are differences between left and right-handed people, and left-handed people are like deviant or something along those lines. So I conduct an experiment and I looked at, okay, who's more likely to steal from me, left-handed people or right-handed people? And then I find, oh wait, there's no difference between these left-handed and right-handed people. This theory is dumb. This makes no sense. And then, so then it's like, okay, well, I have this evidence that challenges my theory. So now I can either reject my theory or revise it. So a key part of theory and science in general is this idea of falsifiability. And kind of the idea here is you have to give an out for a theory. So what I'm saying is, so again, I have this left-handed theory, correct? Like all left-handed people are criminals and they're the issue in the world. Well, falsifiability argues that if you don't give me a method in which I can challenge your theory, then it's not actually a valid scientific theory. So you can make a even more wild example. Say, oh, the ills of whatever university or college you attend, it's because of aliens control it. So aliens control your university or college, and they're the reason why whatever grievance you have is occurring. Okay, cool, that's my theory. Well, how do you actually test that? And the thing is, you probably can't test that. Thus, it is not a scientific theory. You have to give an opportunity for people to challenge your theory. That is, you have to your theory has to be falsifiable. And if it's not kind of a valid scientific theory. And this is important because, as stated in the previous slide, science kind of consists of new findings, kind of challenging old understandings of the world, and then theoretically improving our understanding or creating kind of new understandings of the world. Thus, falsifiability is key to science and psychology. Hypotheses. This is a testable prediction derived from a scientific theory. Theories are general explanations, whereas hypotheses are specific predictions derived from those explanations. Based on their test of hypotheses, scientists can accept the theory that generated these hypotheses, reject this theory outright, or revise it. So again, going back to my left-handed people are all evil and they're the root of all problems in the world, my hypothesis is saying, and then I create a study, and what I do is I put them in a room, I put participants in a room, and I say, and just say there's a bunch of like valuable stuff around, and then I have a secret camera and I'm watching them and I'm taking notes of who is stealing what, and or maybe they don't steal anything. And my hypothesis is that the left-handed participants will steal more than the right-handed participants. But then, boom, boom, I'm doing some stats, and oh wait, that's not true. There are no differences between these groups. So I had my hypothesis. My hypothesis was not supported. Now, because my hypothesis wasn't supported, I have to go back to that general theory, that general explanation of the world, and say, okay, I have this new data that challenges this. So what are my options? As I said in the previous slide, I can reject my theory outright and say my left-handed theory is wrong, or I can revise my left-handed theory and say, oh, maybe maybe left-handed people don't steal, they only, I don't know, do violence more than right-handed people, and that's the issue with the world. So again, a systematic approach using empiricism or kind of empirical method to come to the theoretically most sound conclusions we can come to within a given time. We don't know what we don't know, and thus that's kind of the point. And theoretically, we'll learn more through time and through more scientific experiments. And some common misconceptions about theories include that theories explain one specific event. So for example, a reporter saying something like, the most likely theory for the robbery at the downtown McDonald's is Swiper the Fox. Isn't a theory of the robbery. It attempts to explain only one event rather than a variety of diverse observations, and it doesn't generate testable predictions. So again, a theory is explaining a collection of previous results, and it's generating new testable hypotheses, which in this case, the idea that Swiper the Fox has swiped some Big Macs from the local McDonald's is not a theory, because it's not explaining previous history of some kind of findings, and it's not generating new testable hypotheses. Again, this is just how we talk in normal conversation, which whatever, it can be fine, but scientifically speaking, this is not accurate. Operationalizing concepts. To operationalize is turning concepts into something that can be measured. How do you define aggression? This impacts how you measure it. Different theories operationalize the same concept in different ways. Theories shape how scientists operationalize a concept, what aspect of the concept is primarily focused on, and how the concept is measured. Variables are concepts that can be measured and have different values. So kind of the idea here, and this is kind of a foundational aspect of any science and psychology, obviously. So kind of the idea here is when you consider empiricism, that is the idea that we use observable behavior or something observable, not necessarily behavior. You can do this at a neurological or genetic level to form conclusions about whatever it is that you're interested in. But to get there, you have to operationalize concepts. You have to have operational definitions. So, for example, something like aggression. How do you specifically define aggression? Well, there are many ways to define aggression. It could be punching someone, kicking someone. It can be, gossiping about someone. Maybe you have different definitions of aggression depending on the age. Is it murder? Like, where is the line of aggressive and not aggressive? And depending on where you fall and how you define that concept, aggression, this is going to impact how you measure it. Because, for example, say I define aggression solely as committing a violent felony acts against someone else. Well, if I was going to design a study to kind of measure that, I'm going to just look at criminal records of my participants. How many felonies do they have? Because that's my definition of aggression. But say, for example, someone else defines aggression as how much, whatever, they gossip. So they're going to measure aggression differently. They're going to probably administer a questionnaire that asks of the participant in different ways how often they gossip. So thus, we're looking at the exact same concept or exact same construct, that is aggression. However, we both have different operational definitions, and thus we are going to measure them differently. Now, in addition to that, as stated, different theories operationalize things in different ways because theories offer explanations of previous research and predict or allow you to generate future hypotheses for future research. So thus, for every single thing we cover in this class, every single construct, or every single concept we cover, you're going to have to operationally define something. And different fields and different theories are going to argue with that definition, but for simplicity's sakes and the need to just teach the basics, you have to, we're going to give like a general operational definition, and then you just kind of roll with it. But keep in mind, that is a particular operational definition, and it can be defined in different ways. Reliability and validity. To trust results, the measures must have reliability, which is defined as the consistency of a measure. How often am I getting the same results? And validity, the extent to which a measure assesses what it claims to measure. Is my test measuring what I think it is? A test must be reliable to be valid, but a reliable test can still be completely invalid. So let's get some specifics here for reliability and validity. So let's say for whatever reason, I believe that how much popcorn you eat predicts what your future IQ will be. So for whatever reason, doesn't matter why. Okay, so that's my theory. Popcorn, how much popcorn you eat predicts what your future IQ is. Okay, so I can over and over in time measure how much popcorn you eat every day, right? This is easy. I can reliably, that is consistently, every single day, mark out how much popcorn you get. So that measurement of popcorn is always going to be reliable. I can always consistently get the same results of whatever, your average weekly consumption of popcorn. That is a consistent measurement. I can consistently determine how often you eat popcorn. Okay, so that's going to be very reliable. However, the question is it valid? Is popcorn actually measuring your IQ? Does popcorn actually predict your IQ? So probably not. Thus, that measure can be very reliable, but not valid at all. So a test has to both be reliable, that is, you get the same results every single time you administer it, there's some consistency with it, and it also has to be valid. That is, that it actually is measuring what it claims to measure. That is, popcorn is measuring IQ, and in this case, it's not. So it is reliable, but invalid in that example. What you want to shoot for is reliable and valid. Sampling and representative samples. Usually researchers want to be able to generalize the results to a larger population. A population includes everyone in the category we are interested in studying or learning more about. A representative sample is a sample that reflects the characteristics of the population of interest. Questions of generalizability emerge. If a sample does not mirror characteristics of the population, may be only applicable to more similar samples. So in all research, no matter what field, you are always going to have to engage in sampling. You can never sample everyone, that is the entire population. And that population could be the entire United States, the entire state of Florida, the world population. Not possible. You're always going to have to sample. That is, kind of basically select a subset of people that theoretically represents the overall population. And there are various research methods and statistical methods to ensure that your sample is more representative of your actually representative of your population, which I'm not going to talk about in this class, but that's kind of the general approach. Because in general, what you're trying to do is, through that sample, is to make generalized conclusions about the global population. Now, so, for example, you can imagine this can be challenging for a whole host of reasons. We've already talked about the weird construct, how most research is conducted in Western samples and overwhelmingly in university students. So then the question is that a representative sample of the world population, or maybe the U.S. population, or maybe the university U.S. population? I don't know. So maybe not. But kind of questions do emerge depending on the sample that you recruit. So, for example, say I am just going to look outside my yard and say I live in the suburbs or something along those lines, and I recruit, whatever, 10 of my neighbors, and I have them complete a series of psychology tests about their worldviews or whatever, some kind of construct. And then I say, okay, whoo, that is my sample, and guess what? This sample represents the entire United States. Is that accurate? Is that actually a representative sample? My suburban neighborhood of 10 neighbors? Maybe, but probably not. Thus, it's probably not thus the results I gather from my study of my suburban neighbors may not be generalizable to the entire population. And maybe it's more generalizable to just other suburban populations. I don't know. You can maybe recruit other suburban populations. But so kind of the idea here is, again, sampling or generating a representative sample can be difficult, and if you're limited in your sampling, this can unintentionally create biased results. It doesn't mean it for sure is going to, depending on the measure, but there are kind of potential limitations that occur. Now let's move on to different ways in which we can collect data and conduct experiments, beginning with behavioral observations, kind of umbrella, and there's going to be a couple aspects of this. The first will be structured observations. We can create special stimuli tasks or situations designed to elicit behaviors of interest. Strength, achieve greater controls over the conditions. Limitations, how natural/real is this? Is behavior observed generalizable to behavior in the real world? So this idea is that you come into my research lab and everything is like very much controlled. I can control how much sound is in the room. I can control the wall art. I can control exactly when you take a specific test, what the next thing you do is, in the exact order. I can lay out the exact time that I give you in a very structured, systematic way. And the good thing about this is then I can keep that method, that exact structured, systematic way, and give it to all participants. So thus everybody is exposed to the exact same stimuli in the exact same order. So theoretically I can come to a stronger conclusions, because there's not these other like external variables, like just say like a parent walks in the room, or there's randomly a rave party next door, or some participants take one task or complete one task first, and other participants complete a different task first, and then they go on a lunch break and come back and complete another task later. So that's that kind of chaotic kind of approach can introduce basically other variables that may end up biasing the results that are generated from my experiment. So that's like, oh, good. But then the limitation is, okay, but how natural real is this? This goes back to that ecological validity point that Bronfenbrenner argued. So for example, again, I'd say I'm interested in criminality of people. So I bring people into my research labs. I leave the room, so I leave the participant alone, and I have all this like expensive stuff playing around, and nobody steals anything. Okay, cool. So does that mean like no one ever like engages in theft? Maybe, but it could also be that like, oh, in this research environment, wherein everything's all proper, you're in a university setting, you're going to act a little different. You're not going to act how you quote unquote naturally act. So the question is, how real world, how generalizable to the real world are these are my research results? And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, and you should really conceptualize this as kind of like a spectrum of generalizability. And all kind of methods and approaches have strengths and weaknesses. There's not like the one magical approach that does everything. So thus kind of as you develop as a scientist, you kind of actually typically engage in multiple methods to kind of balance out these limitations, to hopefully draw the most sound conclusions as possible. Next, naturalistic observation. Again, this is a form of behavioral observation. One strength is that you're observing people in the real world. Some limitations, behaviors can be random or rare, difficult to observe, difficult to pinpoint the causes of the behavior observed. So here, as stated, you're observing people in the real world. And let's continue on our example about theft or whatever. So say now I'm interested in seeing, okay, do teenagers steal from the mall more than adults or something along those lines? So say now what you would do is I would observe them from afar, the teenagers. I would not tell them I'm observing them, but I'm watching them in the real world, how they're acting. Which, I mean, there's way less control about what's going on around me. I'm just watching or what's going on during this experiment. I'm just watching the teenagers steal or not steal. So say I'm hiding in some clothes rack and I'm at Macy's or whatever, and I'm just watching the teenagers, and theoretically I'm not arrested for stalking teenagers. And say I find, oh, whatever, I just find some results, they're stealing or they're not stealing. Okay, but I generally, I find those results and boom, I form a conclusion based on those results. Now, woo, cool. Now I have theoretically a lot of ecological validity, right? Because I'm watching these people in the real world. These results are generalizing to the real world because I'm literally in the real world. Now, some limitations include behaviors can be random or rare. It's difficult to observe. And as stated, it's difficult to pinpoint the cause of the behavior. So say I'm watching people from a coat rack, or I'm watching teenagers from a coat rack, and whatever, they are not stealing today. Well, that could just be completely random. Maybe this set of teenagers, for whatever reason, have like a lot of money, they don't need to steal or something. Or maybe teenagers are just walking around Macy's because they have nothing else to do, and they're like, yeah, I don't really like these clothes, I'm not going to steal today. Or maybe they were going to steal clothes from Macy's today, but then as they were walking to Macy's, they saw at Hot Topic there's some kind of like 50% off sale. So they're like, yeah, I'll just go there and buy clothes instead and not steal from Macy's. So all these things are like random, unplanned things that can kind of bias or kind of like interfere with my results. And so thus, it is kind of difficult to pinpoint exactly what the cause of the behavior was. What was the cause of that person, that teenager, that group of teenagers stealing or not stealing? So on the one hand, theoretically higher ecological validity, but on the other hand, because of that high ecological validity, I have far less control about the environment that the participant is interacting with, and thus it's far less systematic, and thus it's kind of difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is that is contributing to particular behaviors, in this case, stealing from Macy's. Observer bias. Seeing or paying attention to things that tend to support one's hypothesis and overlook things that don't. Use multiple observers or blind observers. Participants do not know what group they are assigned to. So kind of the idea here of bias, this does not have to be like intentional. This can be kind of a unconscious bias that occurs. And the idea here is you can think like, okay, say I spent like years developing this theory and now I have sets of hypotheses and I'm like, geez, I just really want this hypothesis to be correct so I can support this theory and whatever, for whatever professional reasons, or like I'm just kind of like pot committed. I'm going to really pay attention and be hyper focused on things that support my hypothesis and overlook things that don't, which obviously can kind of accidentally bias results. Now, one way around this is to use this kind of blind observation or multiple observers. And I'll talk about blind momentarily here. Kind of the idea you can imagine. So, for example, say I've created a new antidepressant drug, right? So then I'm going to I'm going to recruit some participants, and I'm going to give some of the participants the new antidepressant drugs, and then I'm going to give another half of the participants kind of the old, whatever the best antidepressant drug is. And I'm going to see, okay, which at the end of 6 months of participants taking these two types of drugs, which of these drugs have decreased depressive symptoms more. And I'm hoping, obviously, in my mind, that, oh man, I hope my new antidepressant drug decreases depression more than the old drug. So maybe I start treating the participants nicely who are receiving the new drug. So I'm talking to the participants who are receiving the new drug and I'm treating them nice, and maybe I even tell them that they're getting this new magical drug. And thus maybe they feel good about it. So maybe they get a placebo effect out of it. So, but the point here is that maybe intentionally and unintentionally, I am biasing the impacts of the drugs. And thus, maybe because of this kind of like me treating participants really nice, or maybe just hyping up the drug, or accidentally just letting them know that, hey, you're getting a new experimental drug and I don't say anything else about it, and maybe they're like, oh man, this is a numerical drug. Maybe that impacts the results of the depression because they think in their mind, oh, either, oh, this person's really nice to me. Look at that. I feel I have less depressive symptoms at this moment. Or, oh, wow, I got this new magical drug. Maybe it's going to make my depression go away. I feel better. And thus, it can theoretically bias the results. So what you do is you blind it. So AKA, you don't tell the participants which of the two drugs they're getting. That you don't tell the participants if they're getting the new drug, the new antidepressant drug, or the old antidepressant drug. And not only that, what you can do also is then blind the experimenter. So you don't tell the experimenter, whoever it is that is handing out the drugs to the participants, you don't tell them which of the participants are getting the new drug and which of the participants are getting the old drug. So thus, to theoretically decrease the unintentional kind of unconscious bias that may result in treating certain sets of participants differently. Self-reports and observations. It just asks people questions about themselves or others. They consist of interviews, surveys, questionnaires, standardized tests, wherein researchers standardize a test by administering it to a large group of the children to establish norms for the test. It provides an expected range of scores, and individuals who later take the same test will have their results compared to this norming group. It also includes personality scales, such as Myers-Briggs. It includes checklists, which mark the presence or absence of each item. It does not tell us directly about the causes of behavior. Limitations. Young children can accurately recall events and give reliable eyewitness testimony, but they can also be confused by misleading questions, repeated questioning, or the interviewer's overt suggestions. Also, a social desirability effect. So kind of the idea here is that overall we're just asking research participants, I should say, restated, researchers are just asking participants about themselves. So how often do you drink alcohol? How often are you vaping? How often are you gaming? Whatever it is that I'm interested in. Or I could give them also like a standardized test, like a standardized IQ score, IQ test or something along those lines. Also, these little checklist things. So for example, adverse child event checklists, which again, kind of the idea here is that the researcher will give you kind of a list of questions that'll ask, have you ever, have you ever been in poverty? Have you ever lived in poverty? Have you ever been exposed to violence? Have you ever been a victim of violence? Have you been physically abused, emotionally abused, whatever? And then they just kind of add them all up together, and then they sum it all up, and you get a score, and you see that score is correlated with whatever, mental health disorders or physical health or whatever. Dropping out of school, something along those lines. But some limitations of this approach include that they're really not telling you the causes of a particular behavior. So you can imagine like a drug test again. I'm asking you how often you're vaping, and I'm like, okay, it's not really telling me why it is you're vaping. It's just kind of saying, oh, you do vape, 1 to 7 times / infinite times per week. Other limitations include when you're administering this form of research to young children is that although they can be reliable, if they can be easily misled. So if you keep asking the same questions over and over again or give kind of misleading questions, it can bias the results. And you see this all the time with children giving eyewitness testimony, and it's like way inaccurate. And you also see this with like people get like wrapped up in the judicial system and then make false confessions, something along those lines. So thus, those kind of things can bias results. Also, the social desirability effect. So say, for example, I'm administering a questionnaire to some teenagers that are asking them, okay, how often are you vaping? And they're like, oh man, I know that vaping is going to hurt my lungs or whatever, and my parents / adults / elders or whatever, respected people in society, I should not be doing this. Thus, I maybe am going to lie and say that I vape less than I do. So maybe the social desirability effect is kind of, in the case of vaping, really underestimating the rates of vaping within that population, because they understand that vaping is whatever unhealthy for them or something along those lines, and thus are going to kind of fudge those numbers a little bit. Other forms of data collection include physiological measurements. These can include neurological activity, genetic expression, heart rate, stress hormones in the blood. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is fMRI. This measures increases in blood flow to an area of the brain that occurs when a brain area is active during an administered task. The limitation is, what is exactly being measured? So kind of the idea of an fMRI machine, so we put you in a machine and have you complete, for example, and we have you complete some kind of like a memory task or something along those lines. And kind of the idea here is that we're getting images of blood flow within the brain, which is telling us, oh, areas of parts of the brain are more active when completing this memory task. So theoretically, this part of the brain is involved with completing this type of memory task. And so these two things are now correlated. So then the question though is like, what exactly is being measured? And how do we like interpret these results? Is like the brain by itself like autonomously like causing this? So like, is this kind of like a biological determinist kind of a thing? Like, is this area of the brain causing this, or is this some kind of a experience situation wherein, as we live through our social world, our environments kind of shape our brain, and thus maybe we are, imagine someone who just uses memory a lot within their daily lives for whatever reason, they have a job that they have to just memorize quick sets of information. Maybe that is kind of contributing to the development of that area of the brain that's active during this memory task. All you are ultimately finding with this is kind of just a correlation between some of an indirect measurement, really, because it's just blood activity levels, blood flow, related to whatever, some kind of specific task within the scanner. And thus, like, kind of unpackaging what that means can be quite challenging for a lot of complex reasons that are like beyond the scope of this class. One other immediate kind of more direct, easier to understand example is also that if you're an fMRI machine, you can't move. So like young kids, for example, if you put them in there, they'll often move, and then that screws up the results completely. You have to basically be completely still, or the results become like warped. Case studies. This is an in-depth examination of an individual or small number of individuals. Strengths can provide a rich picture of an atypical development. Findings can be used to generate hypotheses for future larger studies. Limitations include generalizability questions. And although the findings from case studies may not generalize to a wide segment of the population, they could be a rich source of new hypotheses that can be explored by future researchers with more typical or representative groups of individuals. So I put that in limitations, but it's kind of like a critique of the limitation. But okay, so basically what the case study is really you're just following a very small amount of people for a long period of time. So this can range from like literally one person to like 10 people. And you follow them for years, and you collect all kinds of data on them, just like so much data on this very, very, very small amount of people. And they do that, and researchers typically do this because maybe it's some kind of atypical development. So maybe some kind of super rare neurological disorder, or maybe a super rare like disease, something along those lines. And thus there's not a lot of people. It's difficult to recruit from that population. So you just, have 1 to like 10 people, and you follow them for a very long period of time. And then theoretically, based on there could be generalizability because you collect so much data from those participants that you could take pieces of that data and maybe generalize it to the rest of the population. However, still, you're really working with a very, very, very small sample and a very unique sample. And thus, there are still generalizability questions that do emerge. So you're getting a ton of information, but then the question is like, how applicable is this to the larger population? Ethnography, a research technique adapted from the field of anthropology, in which a researcher lives with a group of people as a participant observer. Taking part in the group's everyday life, while also observing and interviewing the people in the group. Goal is to use observations to understand how people make sense of their world and the experiences in it. Samantha Punch, for example, lived in Bolivia in order to study children's development in a rural community. Venkatesh lived with gang members for almost 10 years collecting data and wrote a book about it. Some limitations include potential changes from the researcher's presence, the influence of researchers' biases, jeopardization of the researcher's personal safety, and considerable amount of time necessary for the study. So kind of the idea here is it's almost like naturalistic studies, but here now the participants know that I'm there and I'm going to stay with these people for like a shit ton of time. So for example, the Punch study in Bolivia, kind of staying with these rural Bolivians for months, years at a time. And basically you are literally like, this is high degree of ecological validity theoretically, because you're living with them, you're watching their real world, everyday behaviors and all behaviors, to the extent that you can get access to this. And thus you can make you can understand how people make sense of their world, understand the world, what are the assumptions of humanity built within that culture, and kind of their everyday behaviors. You also saw this in kind of the gang Venkatesh study, where you live with them for almost 10 years. That is a lot of data with a lot of very, very interesting information. I actually know someone at UF who would live with Alaskan natives for like years, and then he would come back to UF and present results, and it was incredible research. But however, some potential limitations include that maybe the behavior of the gang members or the rural Bolivians or whoever are affected by the presence of the researcher. Now, theoretically, because they're there for like months/years, you can't fake it that long. Like you're living your life, so maybe that's less of an influence. There could be some researcher's biases wherein, say, I'm really like attached to a particular community. I'm living with them now. They're kind of providing for me in some regard. So maybe I start to, my interpretations of like their behavior is a little more positive than it should be, something along those lines. And this is just a possibility. This is not like inherently going to happen. Also, personal safety, especially for like gang members, you're putting your life in line, you're living in a rural community. So this is a very hands-on approach, and thus there can be additional risk than just conducting an experiment at the whatever university or college. And also, it just takes a lot of time. It costs a lot of money. This is probably one of the most, besides like researchers probably being scared of their safety, this is probably one of the largest ones here, that it just takes a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of resources, which academics are basically continuously pressured to publish constantly. So in a project that takes this long, there can be kind of financial disincentives to kind of engaging in it, which is kind of unfortunate, but those are some of the limitations. Experimental method. Investigator manipulates some aspect of the environment to see how this affects the behavior of the sample of individuals studied. The question is, can we create baby geniuses, for example? There are two types of variables in the experimental method. There are others, but we're keeping it simple in an undergrad psych class. Independent variable, referred to as the IV. This is a variable that is manipulated by the researcher so that its effects can be assessed. This is also referred to as the predictor variable. And the dependent variable, the DV, the variable expected to be affected. This is also referred to as the outcome variable. So for example, in our drug, antidepressant drug example that I laid out before, the IV in that case, or the kind of idea, and this would be an experimental method, because I'm giving some groups, some participants, I should say, a new experimental drug, new anti-experimental, or I should say, a new experimental antidepressant drug, and then I'm giving another group of participants the old antidepressant drug. So I'm basically manipulating which drug the participants receive. Thus, the drug is the independent variable, and in that case, the dependent variable would be depressive symptoms. So the researcher, again, is manipulating which participants get which, in this case, antidepressant drugs, in order to form conclusions and theoretically find causal relations between the type of antidepressant drug taken and the amount of depressive symptoms present within a participant. And in that case, again, the depressive symptoms are the dependent variable. That is the outcome variable. And the IV is the drug, otherwise stated, the predictor variable is the drug. Let's break this down in more detail. There are three critical features of experimental methods. random assignment of participants to different experimental conditions, assigning participants to experimental or control group without systematic differences that could affect the outcome of the variable, manipulations of the IV, experimental control can control other variables such as the control group. The strength, as stated, is that theoretically you can infer causation and increase our understanding of human development. Some limitations include the generalizability to the real world and sometimes impossible to conduct or unethical. So, as stated before, we have two drugs, the new experimental antidepressant drug and the old antidepressant drug, and we want to see which of these drugs how do these drugs impact our DV, our outcome variable, that is depressive symptoms within those participants taking the drugs. That is the IV in the predictive variable. Thus, the experimenter is manipulating the IV, but the crucial point here is random assignment. We want to assign groups to the one of the two conditions, that is the old drug group or the new drug group. We want to randomly assign them because we don't want to accidentally put in or make one group a specific, like for example, whatever. We'll make one group all women and another group all men or something, or all group 180-year-olds and all group all 17-year-olds. And thus only one group will receive the experimental drug or whatever. Only men receive the experimental drug, or only women receive the experimental drug, or only people over 90 years old get to receive the experimental drug. That can bias the results. You want to mix it up. You want to draw them out of a hat to ensure that you have a representative sample. And this is done, again, through random assignment to groups. You can also imagine like a public policy program. So for example, say I create a new after-school program for people who live in poverty or something along those lines. We can and say that the United States is going to pay for some people in poverty, some children in poverty to attend this program. And what you can do is go to that, researchers can go to that program, so whatever, Head Start or something along those lines, but like a new Head Start, we'll call it like Head Start 2 or something. So so some, again, some children, some preschoolers are assigned to Head Start 2, some are not. And what researchers can do is collect data from those two groups. That is, those two groups are naturally forming. That is because one group, again, attends Head Start 2, the other group does not attend Head Start 2. So researchers can collect data on, I don't know, how well they're performing in pre-K academically, how well they learn their ABCs, how well they count, how well are they at controlling their impulses, how well are they at kind of social communication, something along those lines. And you do that from both groups. So you compare the results of language development among the preschoolers who attend Head Start 2 to language development of preschoolers who did not attend Head Start 2. And theoretically, what you want to see is Head Start 2 increased language development. And then thus, theoretically, you want to make everybody attend Head Start 2. So in that case, our IV, our predictor variable, is attending Head Start 2, and our DV in that case, or our outcome variable in that case, is language development. And our control group are preschoolers who don't attend Head Start 2, and our experimental group that is exposed to the experimental condition, exposed to that predictor, that IV, that independent variable, is children who attended Head Start 2. Now, some questions arise with kind of the ethical nature of this. So again, I'm interested in the impact of war, of certain economic policies, of natural disasters. Well, I can't really create an earthquake in Florida, and if I could, it would kind of be unethical. So I cannot create, okay, I'm going to put an earthquake in Jacksonville and see how that impacts preschoolers' language development and compare it to language development in preschoolers in Daytona Beach who didn't experience an earthquake. So that becomes a little unethical. So you can't like torture people, or I can't like subject some people to war conditions and not. So thus, you cannot always kind of engage in these experimental methods because at least now in the 2020s, depending on how long I use this video for, that's why I don't want to say exact year, you cannot be as unethical as you could be 100 years ago, at least. Which brings us to quasi-experimental design. This is sometimes a situation occurs without a researcher creating it, and we can use that situation as a natural or quasi-experiment to test a hypothesis. Hurricanes, war, economic depression, macro level shifts. So kind of the idea here is that in a case of that earthquake example where just say this case, let's say an earthquake hits someplace LA or something along those lines. And then so I look at preschoolers who experienced a earthquake in LA, and I compare their language development as a preschooler to the language development of Daytona Beach, Florida preschoolers. And then I just compare the results. Well, that is quasi-experimental because the researcher is not manipulating that IV or that predictor variable, because again, the IV in this case is exposure to the earthquake. The researcher cannot manipulate that. But in the real world, two naturally forming groups emerge. That is, again, preschoolers who was exposed to that earthquake and preschoolers who have no idea an earthquake happened. And thus, I can then compare the language development of those two groups. The researcher did not create those two groups. They're two naturally forming groups. Thus, it is quasi-experimental. Next, correlational studies. These look at how two or more variables relate to each other. Researchers do not create an independent variable as they would in experimental design, interested in the strength and direction of the relationship between the correlation. So they're just basically saying how two variables, keeping it very simple here, are related to each other. And let's jump into more specifics here. Correlations can vary from -1 to +1 and can be either positive, as one variable increases, so does the other. It could be negative, as one variable increases, then the other decreases. Or it could be 0. There are no relationship between the variables. And the correlations are depicted in a scatter plot, again, ranging between -1 to +1. So kind of the idea here is that, again, the correlations range from -1 to +1. So two variables are related to each other on the scale of -1 to +1. And the idea is that the closer you are to -1 or 1, or I can just say the absolute value of 1, the stronger that relationship between those two variables are, the stronger that correlation is. So, for example, say every time I stand up, I move my legs. That is a correlation of 1, and it's a positive correlation. Every time I stand up, so as standing up increases, leg movement increases, and that is 1 to 1. That's going to happen every single time. Or for a perfect negative correlation, every time I drink, every time a sip of alcohol I drink, the amount of soberness I am decreases. So drinking goes up, soberness decreases. This is a perfect -1 correlation. In the real world, there is never a perfect correlation because, again, development is very, very complex. And there's never one single variable causing a single action or a single behavior. It's always a collection of variables, and thus a correlation will fall somewhere in that range between -1 to 1. And again, if it's 0, that means there's basically no correlation. So you can go back to that popcorn and IQ example. There's no correlation between eating popcorn and scoring high on your IQ. It's 0 correlation. Now let's look at some examples here, beginning in the top left corner of our screen, -1 correlation. So here we have a negative correlation, and it's described as an R equals -1. Again, R being a way to characterize the strength of the relationship between two variables. This is also called a correlation coefficient. So we have on the y-axis preschool behavioral problems, and then on our x-axis we have birth weight. And this is all fake data I just created before doing this. And what you can see in the top left-hand corner is that as birth weight increases, pre-K problem behaviors decrease. So what is that? Because one is increasing and one is decreasing, it's a negative correlation. You can also think of this like as multiplication, correct? So as something is increasing, positive, another thing is decreasing, thus what is a positive times a negative? It's a negative, thus a negative correlation. So there you go. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's the opposite. This time we have a positive correlation in R equals 1. So now we have, as birth weight increases, positive, pre-K behavior problems increase. So we have two things increasing at the same time, and in this case we have R equals 1. And in the right-hand screen, you can see a 0 correlation. It's actually very, very difficult to create a 0 correlation because like everything kind of correlates. So it would just be very, very low numbers. It would be like R equals 0.00001, but whatever. This is close enough to a negative correlation. And you can see here that there's this, unlike the other two graphs where there's a line, you can see a clear relationship between the two variables. This no correlation is just chaotic. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no association. There's no relationship. There is no correlation between these two variables. Thus, r equals 0. And as I said before, r equals 1 or r equals -1 never happens. You're never going to get close to that. So basically, you can see here, though, on these other scatter plots, what visually a weaker correlation, a smaller effect size looks like. So you can see again with from the left-hand side, a strong positive correlation, that perfect straight line. And then as you go down to 0.8, which is still a very, very high correlation, probably not going to find that ever. That is still, you can definitely still see that clear line. And then as you go down in the strength of your correlation, that line becomes a little more difficult to see. And thus, what researchers will do is try and describe the strength of the correlation based on the correlation coefficient. So they'll say, oh, my correlation in my research I found is a 0.4. My R equals 0.4. Thus, I'm going to describe this as a moderately weak, or I'm going to describe it as moderate, or a good, or something. So they add some kind of like adjective to it to try and describe the strength of their correlation. And these have a lot of variabilities in the description. So people can describe the same correlation as like, oh, this is weak, or like, ah, this is relatively weak, or ah, this is moderate. So that kind of fluctuates, but the graph itself stays the same. Now let's jump into some examples to make this a little more concrete. So for example, the more days students report online shopping during class, the lower their test scores tended to be. This is a negative correlation because as online shopping increased, test scores decreased. So again, the more days students reported online shopping during class, so as online shopping increases, so we have a positive increase here, the lower their test scores. So we have a positive and negative. Thus, what is a positive times a negative? That is a negative. Thus, a negative correlation. Now, the more losses the local basketball team experiences, the more likely that their fans will boo at the games. So we have a positive correlation. That is, as losses increase, booing increases. So we have 2. What is a positive times a positive? A positive. So positive correlation. And then finally, participants' Mario Kart finishes tended to improve when their alcohol level increased. So that is, as drinking increased, that is a positive. Their performance on Mario Kart increased. That is, they did better on Mario Kart. So the more you drink, the better you do on Mario Kart. What is that correlation? What is a positive times a positive? I'm going to let it sit for 3 seconds. It is a positive correlation. All right, we got it. And then a zero correlation would just literally say there is no relationship between finishes in Mario Kart and drinking. You're not going to have that on a quiz question because it's blatantly obvious. All right, developmental research design, beginning with cross-sectional designs. In these types of designs, that is cross-sectional, different groups are compared. One type of group is age. You can compare other types of groups, but a simple one is age. It provides information about age differences. Measuring the effect of age on an outcome variable. So, for example, that would mean the relationship between age and development. However, there are cohort effects. Effects of being born as a member of a particular generation in a particular historical context. So say I recruit some participants to my study, and I recruit people who are over 80 years old and people who are 18 years old. And what I do is have the 80-year-olds and the 18-year-olds complete some kind of internet proficiency task. And we see, okay, the old people, they suck at internet proficiency. They're bombing. They can't upload TikToks. Their Insta accounts, they're not getting any DMs. Like they're bombing. So kind of based on that, I can say, you have to draw a conclusion. You have to interpret those results. And one interpretation can be, oh, once you become an old person, you just suck at technology. Boom, that's it. This is a age deterministic kind of situation. You hit X age, boom, you suck at technology. Well, that could be true, or there could be a whole host of other reasons for that to occur. Because really what all cross-sectional design is like a snapshot in a moment of history. You have the participants come into the lab one time, complete the task, boom, you never see them again. You never saw them before your experiment, and you'll never see them again afterwards. It's just purely a snapshot moment of time. Thus, you really don't understand fully what it is or it's difficult to unpack the reasons for group differences because you have less background information on all participants. So is it age that's the issue with like technology proficiency, or is it something else? We don't know. It could be something like cohort effects. So maybe it's not age, but rather the 18-year-old has spent their entire life chronically online, while the 80-year-old has only spent the last, 10 years chronically online. Thus, the 18-year-old has infinitely more practice and experience dealing with that technology, and it's really thus not a kind of biological age-related difference, but rather an experience difference, wherein different cohorts are exposed to different kind of real-world events and participate in different activities, and that's the reason for the difference in age proficiency. Not some like you hit 80 years old and all of a sudden you suck at technology. So as stated, some limitations include cohort effects are confounded potentially. It focuses on differences between groups, not changes within groups, people, that is intra differences. Researchers learn nothing about how people change with age. It is cheaper and quicker than longitudinal studies. So it's looking at differences between groups, but it's not looking at change, and that is people within groups. Again, this is a snapshot in time. I see this person one time, they come into my lab one time, and I'll never see them again. Thus, I really don't have a developmental history of this person. I don't know if maybe they were amazing at technology when they were 50 years old, but once they hit 70 years old, they sucked at technology. I don't know anything about their background, or far less about their background, because it's a snapshot in time, and I'm really just focusing on comparing the two groups, not looking at changes within the groups. One reason why the super majority of studies you read will be cross-sectional is because they are very, very cheap. They are quick. There's pressure to publish, and it's not like these results are just completely like invalid or anything. There's just limitations to it. So thus, in general, most studies you will see are cross-sectional by design. Next, longitudinal studies. One cohort of individuals is assessed repeatedly over time. It traces changes in individuals as they change. This focuses on intra-change, not interchange. It provides information about age change rather than age differences. So now, instead of having the participants come in one time and I never see them ever again, I have the participants come to my lab, we'll say every single year. So say I have a cohort, and every single year I test their technology proficiency. So that way I can track changes in their development, change within, and kind of understand, or better understand, kind of the mechanisms and the developmental trajectory of technology proficiency, because I'm testing it over and over again across years of time. So I'm literally measuring like change through time rather than comparing age to age groups. Some strengths include can indicate whether characteristics and behavior measured remain consistent over time. So can early life experiences predict later life behaviors? Some limitations include age effects and times of measurement effects are confounded. Did COVID happen between your data collection? It takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money, requires a larger lab usually. The measurement methods that seem good at the start of the study may seem dated by the end. Participant retention rates and testing effects. So as stated, because you're collecting data from the same group of participants for theoretically years, some of these studies go on for like 50 years. Like there's a famous study in England that this has happened. Because of that, you can measure all kinds of variables and say, okay, did something that happened to this person at 10 years old predict some outcome when they were 40 years old? You have that data now, which is nice to have. You can really look at kind of how well early life experiences or adolescent experiences or whatever age predict later life experiences. Some limitations include time of measurement effects. So basically, for example, say I'm conducting a 50-year longitudinal study and all of a sudden COVID happens. Well, now we have a radical shift in our environment. Is that going to bias my results? I don't know, maybe. It takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money, as I stated before. Also, sometimes because studies are so long, just say again 50 years, what science's understanding of the best way to measure, I'll just make up something, extroversion, may be different in 1950 versus 2020, whatever. Because our understanding of science changes, the measures we use can also change. Thus, through time, we may have to change our measures. And then it's like, okay, can we really compare our results from those earlier years to our new results with different measurements? Maybe, maybe not. It's difficult. Also, participant retention rates. So through time, the longer studies last, people drop out of the study. They're not going to 100% of participants are never going to come back for 50 years. They're not going to last all 50 years. And what you end up seeing generally is that the most at risk, the most stressed, the most traumatized the most disenfranchised people drop out of the study. So thus, you may end up kind of underestimating your conclusions, and your results may underestimate the impact of certain biological or psychological construct, because the most at-risk people are now out of the study, and you're left with kind of like the most protected populations. Also, testing effects. So say I administer the same test over and over again for 50 years, theoretically, you can just master that test, and then it's like, okay, are we really measuring the same thing? Because now you're just really good at taking this one task, a test, and after taking it for 30 years, thus it's kind of fundamentally different. You taking the test for the first time versus you taking the test for the 20th time. So these questions emerge. And finally, sequential design. It combines cross-sectional approach and a longitudinal approach in a single study. It can reveal which age-related trends are developmental in nature, which age trends differ from cohort to cohort, and time of measurement effects. Some limitations are they are very difficult and they cost a lot of money. So what you do here is you do the same basically longitudinal effects with different samples. And what you do is, say I have one longitudinal study going with whatever 100 participants. Well, what you can do is that every 10 years you add another new group, so it resets the time. So you have multiple cohorts going, progressing longitudinally in your study at all times. Thus, you can potentially lead out cohort effects, time of measurement effects, and still find that intra-change. And you can even do comparison change. So you have a ton of data. Obviously, this is a fuck ton of money, and it takes a lot of time. So these kind of studies are very, very, very rare. Next, a meta-analysis. This really deals with a replication crisis, and the idea here is that researchers can measure the same exact thing and do the exact same experiment, and they often find different results. And then the question is like, okay, why are we getting different results even though we're doing the exact same thing? And this is referred to as a replication crisis. It's not just in psychology, it's in other fields as well, which then calls into question, like, what the hell are we doing and how do we interpret these results? This is where one method to kind of deal with this is a meta-analysis. And this results of multiple studies addressing the same question are synthesized to produce overall conclusions, aids in the confidence of research findings. So say we're all measuring the impact of birth weight on whatever, some kind of health outcomes, and say, oh man, there are different results, and we're measuring the same thing. So what a meta-analysis researcher will do, or a researcher conducting a meta-analysis study, is, okay, I'm going to find every study related to this exact measurement, this exact construct, this exact correlation, and throw it into this massive, basically, statistical database. And then based on all those results, off of all these studies that I didn't conduct, what you do is basically email researchers, or researchers will update their data or upload their data online for you to just take for free. So either contact them or get it online, and then just throw it in a massive database. And based on that whole collection of results across the whole field in the same kind of examining the same construct, again, kind of throw it all in a database, and then theoretically come to, and then it spits out results, and then theoretically come to like the firmest conclusion you possibly can come to based on all the results and of all the research in that field. So for example here, birth weight and mortality in adults is systematic analysis, meta-analysis. So in this case, you can see underlined, they retrieved 22 studies. And then I underline a couple red points for their conclusion. And you can see this even just basic correlational knowledge. You can kind of break this down a little bit. These results show an inverse but moderate association. So inverse means negative. So there's a negative correlation, and the moderate association means the effect size between birth weight and adult mortality. So that is the lower your birth weight, the higher your adult mortality is. And it's strongly associated with cancer deaths. So in this case, higher birth weight, so maybe just being like obese or something like that at birth, being strongly associated with an increased risk of cancer death. So there's a positive correlation. So there's an example right there, collecting all these data, data from all these different studies and coming to a larger conclusion. And then you can see, you can understand it a little bit, even with just kind of basic knowledge. Significance. We need to conduct statistical tests to determine whether we can generalize our findings from our sample to the population. Statistical significance. This can be thought of as a probability. That is, the finding would have occurred by chance less than 1 in 20 times, or 5 in 100 times. We say there is a statistical difference between the two groups. this is referred to as P is less than 0.05. And you'll see this when you work through the articles, empirical studies within our class. P is less than 0.05. Sometimes you'll see P is less than 0.001 or less than 0.01. And basically what this is saying, roughly speaking, this is not 100% correct. I understand as like a longtime stats professor myself, statisticians right now losing their mind at this, but this is good enough for an entry-level course. The idea here is that P less than 0.05 means that the results that you found, the probability of those results occurring by chance alone is less than 5 in 100. That is less than 5%. So let's go back to our example for our drug example. So we have one set of participants receiving our new antidepressant drug and a different set of participants receiving the old antidepressant drug, and we're comparing their depressive symptoms, that is the DV, the outcome variable, at the end of the experiment. Now let's say we do find a significant difference, and we find that statistically the group who received the new antidepressant drug had less depressive symptoms than the group who received the old antidepressant drug. And what you'll do then is put in parentheses, P is less than 0.05. Okay? Now what that is telling you is that the probability that that difference occurred due to chance is less than 5%. So because, correlations can occur by chance. So just random shit just happens in the real world. But you want to idea here is that this P less than 0.05, you want a measurement of how much of this finding occurring by chance is acceptable. That can be 5%, but also in stuff that actually really matters, like a drug test like this, that P number is going to be very, very small. It's going to be like 0.001 or 0.01. So in that case, that roughly stated, there's only if it's P is less than 0.01, there's only a 1% chance, I should say, that this finding, that is, that our new drug decreases depressive symptoms more than the old drug, there's only a 1% chance that this occurred purely through chance, due to some sort of random occurrence. So thus, we can be confident that this result is not due to chance, but is actually real. And thus our sample, our finding, in this case, that our new antidepressant drug decreases depressive symptoms more than conventional treatment is sound. There's only a 5% chance, or there's 5% or 1% chance that result occurred due to chance. So it's basically a way to measure the confidence in our results. Again, roughly speaking, not exactly correct, but close enough. Continuing on. A difference is a difference that makes a difference. What we're getting at here is this idea of practical significance. That is the real world importance of a significant result. Some caveats with statistical significance include, that is that P is less than 0.05 or less than 0.01, whatever. The larger the sample size, the greater the odds that a result will be significantly significant. Or I should say, statistically significant. So for example, say we find a significant correlation, however, that correlation is only an R equals 0.06, aka, if you remember, in that range of -1 to 1 for correlations, that is a very, very, very low correlation. So say for example, we find a significant correlation of R equals 0.06 between IQ and fingernail length in a sample of 500,000 people. So we have a huge sample, we found a significant correlation, however, our R, our effect size, our correlation coefficient is only 0.06. So we have the significant statistical significance, yet it's so minuscule in magnitude that it would be essentially meaningless for predicting anything. So just because something is significantly associated or significantly correlated, or there's a significant difference between groups, does not mean it actually matters in the real world at all. So say, for example, again, we have we recruit boys and girls, who are like 11 years old, and we give them an extroversion test. And we'll say that the scale ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being maximum extroverted. And say boys score 9.9 and girls score 9.8 on average. Well, say we recruit 1 million participants and we find a statistical difference. Okay, yeah, that is a statistical difference, but what is actually the meaningful difference of this? What is the practical significance of this? Does this actually matter? What is the practical difference of 9.9 and a 9.8 extroversion score? Probably very, very little. There is a very small effect size. So two groups being different or two things being correlated alone is not enough to tell you if that is actually meaningful in any way. Thus, where effect sizes or that R comes into play. And there are other forms of this, but that's good enough for this class. And another example here for effect sizes. So say a study has found significant differences between groups. The two groups differences are P is less than 0.05, but with a small effect size that is probably not very meaningful, as we discussed. However, imagine a different study where they found a significant or non-significant group difference. So again, there's no significant difference between the groups. The two groups are the same size, that is that P is greater than 0.05. But say, for example, even though the P is greater than 0.05, say it's P equals 0.06. So for example, so there's a 6% chance that this occurred due to chance. Okay, what should we say? Okay, well, that's not significant. It's important to keep in mind that these P's are basically just made up. As a social convention of researchers, have just decided that P is less than 0.05 is meaningful. And again, different researchers have kind of different standards. So again, this is a social convention. So anyway, so say we find a difference, there's a non-significant difference between the group because P is all of a sudden 0.06. It's not less than 0.05. However, say that R is very, very strong. Say it's like 0.6 or something. Well, that is a huge effect size for psychology. So it's like, okay, we have this massive effect size, but it's still only P equals 0.06. So do we just throw away that finding? What does that mean? And this is kind of a new kind of development in statistics, and we're moving beyond just significance, but also looking at this effect size. So just because something isn't significant, especially if it's borderline significant and it has a large effect size, that actually can be more meaningful than something that is statistically significant but has a very, 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 very small effect size. And these are the things you work through, really like kind of graduate school level, but these are just basic introductions. And finally, some challenges in conducting culturally sensitive research. As stated, about 95% of the world are not U.S. citizens. However, they make up the majority, in the West in general, makes up the majority of research participants. Thus, the question of the generalizability occurs. Cross-cultural research requires procedures are meaningful in each culture and mean the same thing across different subculture and cultural groups. Translations, for example, or are tasks culturally relevant? Do they mean the same thing? And it's work to keep their own cultural values from biasing their perceptions, differences within groups, and different versus deficient. So briefly working through this, translation, for example, everyone understands who speaks multiple languages that things don't translate one-to-one. Thus, translating an English task to another different language can be quite challenging, especially if that language is kind of like uncommonly spoken, or that it's not like traditional like Western language, like Spanish or something along those lines. Thus, translating is very, very difficult, and you can lose kind of like meaning in that translation. So what you have to do a lot of times is translate it to whatever, some rural language. We'll just make up something here, or whatever. I'll say Swahili because I've had to do this before. So you have to translate it to Swahili, and then what you will do is you'll have a Swahili speaker who also speaks English, then takes that Swahili newly translated task. So say it's a questionnaire, and I've translated to Swahili. Now the Swahili speaker is going to go back and translate it back to English. And then you compare that new English translation with the original English translation, and you say, are these the same thing? Do they mean the same thing? And then you have to go through sets of rounds of edits to try and get that measurement, that questionnaire, better translated to make it more applicable to the culture that you're interested in. And this is very, very difficult. Also, some tasks aren't all culturally relevant. So we had like, again, speaking from personal experience, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we had to be mindful of like tasks and games and toys that are used in the West, but aren't really used in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And thus, those tasks, because those toys and those games are not going to have the same cultural relevancy in the Congo. So thus, if they don't do well, the Congolese child does not do well in that task, it doesn't mean that they're really like bad. They don't have they're underdeveloped in whatever it is that toy is supposed to be measuring, but rather they just have no cultural familiarity with it. So thus, it's kind of difficult to draw conclusions based on kind of these cultural differences. which ultimately brings you to like difference versus deficiency. You have to be kind of keep in mind that just because there are differences between cultures does not mean that one culture is like superior and one group is like deficient than another, for a whole host of reasons. Again, translational differences, differences in tasks. You can imagine a Congolese researcher developing a research questionnaire or sets of toys that measure whatever, some kind of developmental construct in young children, and then trying to bring that to the United States, and then United States, like U.S. American children being like, what the hell is this? That doesn't make the U.S. American children like deficient at that task. It just means that a way of measuring whatever that construct is isn't necessarily culturally relevant or applicable to that population. All right, so thank you so much for everyone listening. I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.